all the good infrastructure that was left from Soviet Union was not maintained and honestly heavily neglected because of corruption. But Putin was never interested in bettering the lives of his people or making Russia this powerful nation by building up its own society. So Putin kind of saw that this is kind of the same thing that a lot of dictators do. They choose a small dictators and fascists. They choose a small minority that most people would not relate to because they don't know somebody who's queer, or they don't know somebody that's trans, or they don't know that, or they actually do know those people, but they don't know that they are because they're not out. So he was able to shift the perspective so that instead of complaining about how bad the government is, Putin took Russian people's homophobia to distract them from his own inability to govern.
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean C. Fedig. Increasingly, Russian citizens opposed to the war are fleeing their country, taking asylum in other places around the world. A significant number of these folks are queer, leaving not just because of their opposition to the war, but fleeing severe persecution in Russia as the country cracks down on the LGBT community, and they're landing in places that are skeptical of them because of the war in Ukraine. Today, I'm talking to Maxim Eye-BAD-off, coordinator with Rusa LGBTQ+, a network for Russian-speaking LGBTQ+ individuals, their friends, supporters, and loved ones. They provide informational support to asylum seekers and organize social events to increase acceptance and inclusion of LGBTQ+ people within the Russian-speaking public. We talk about the queer climate in Russia today, how it's evolved, the feedback loop of LGBTQ oppression, how the anti-LGBT policies instituted in Russia are being mirrored in red states here in the US that then inform further oppressive policies in Russia, the war in Ukraine, how it's created a global diaspora of Ukrainian and Russian refugees, and how you can support the community. If you like this episode or any episode, please give it a like on your favorite podcast platform, and or subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. And as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to email deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. Let's do a deep dive. Maxim, thanks for being here. How are you?
I am doing fabulous, almost to recover from Pride, almost. A couple of more good nights of sleep and I'll be back to new.
What happens to you at Pride that you take so long to recover?
Oh, what doesn't happen to me at Pride? It's a very busy season. I work with the queer community in different capacities. I do advocacy, I do community building, I do nightlife, I do drag. So Pride is the busiest time of the year for me. Nonstop events, nonstop seeing people and going to different parties and supporting folks, and just it's a lot for a body, mind, spirit, and soul.
So it's not like what happens at Pride stays at Pride thing.
I sometimes it does. It depends on what happens. But most of the work, I try to keep it, inspirational all year round. Because, Pride is 365. And the power that's available to us on Pride is available to us outside of Pride.
That's a good message.
Requoting RuPaul, he says that the power available to you in drag is available to you out of drag.
That's so true. And so important right now. Which brings me to why I'm excited to have you here. So tell me about Rusa LGBTQ+, what you do, why you do it, how you do it.
Sure. Thank you again for giving us a platform to speak about what we do. Rusa LGBTQ stands for Russian-speaking Americans, and it has existed since 2008. So that's 4 presidents ago. If you're looking at it from a historical point of view, Bush was president when they created this organization, and we're celebrating our 15-year anniversary. This year, we are a registered 501c3, so we are official, and we help the Russian-speaking LGBTQ community here. We work with a lot of immigrants. We work with refugees and asylum seekers. We help the new folks who come here to adapt We provide them with connections to legal advice. We provide them with whatever help they might need from us, whether it's letters for shelter and housing, whether it's a certain connections with work, whether it's connection to a medical professional. We have an incredible medical coordinator on our team who works for NYU Langone, and Alexander Trifonov, and he helps so many people, 37 people a week just from Rusa, getting them healthcare and answering any medical questions they have. And most importantly, what we do, we create community. We do a lot of community events, and community events vary from informational sessions to just tea parties, to club parties, to hikes in nature, to, of course, our signature annual Brighton Beach March, Brighton Beach Pride, which is the first of the Pride parades that happens in New York, because, New York has a million of them.
Mm-hmm.
Every neighborhood now has one, and now Long Island has 3 prides, and then Jersey. So it's a lot of marching, but we usually open up the season. We do it second to last week, Sunday of May, and then we march right in Coney Island, Brighton Beach, like in the heart of the Russian-speaking diaspora here in the United States. So that's kind of a short list of what we do. We have a team. We actually yesterday had a board meeting. It was 9 hours long, but we have a big team of volunteers and coordinators and just the most incredible board members. And we really try to figure out what the needs of our community are and how can we best advocate for our community, whether it's politically or socially or just the best job that we can do.
There's an event coming up this next week or next weekend, right?
We have a lot of events, and that's kind of like primarily what I am focused on as the national coordinator with events. Next week, we have our, biannual meeting, but we have 2 events later this month. One is a drag and live music show at a prominent queer bar in Astoria. And then at the end of the month, we have a live music theater show at Coney Island, USA. So we have maybe 9 events this month, and they vary from, yoga on a beach to informational sessions, meeting with lawyer, to informational session with somebody who works for City University of New York and helps people. Like, so we're gonna tell people how to apply to just, good old gay time.
So you mentioned the drag event, and I want to ask a little bit about that before we move on, because, in many parts of the United States, drag and drag events are under pretty serious threat right now, both legislatively, but also physically, with pretty far right-wing extremists showing up and, throwing some muscle around. But, both you and I live in pretty progressive areas.
Mm-hmm.
What's the impact of that? Or what are you seeing out there in your side of the country as it relates to kind of drag events and drag?
Well, I can tell you that I am coming into Rusa with an experience in the drag scene. I am a drag artist myself, but I've started doing a drag after being in the scene with the Brooklyn drag queens and kings and non-binary things, all kinds of various performers for years now. Brooklyn drag scene is one of the most vibrant, diverse, cutting edge, innovative scenes, I would say, in the world. But for me, as somebody who grew up in Southern Brooklyn, New York is huge, and obviously the Brooklyn scene is primarily in the north, in a lot of the gentrified neighborhoods. And then I come from Southern Brooklyn, which has historically and always been working class, immigrant, very conservative, especially Brighton Beach. Mm-hmm. So there aren't a lot of drag events happening there. So there is that kind of, you ask how is the situation in our progressive center. Brooklyn itself is not progressive in the entirety of its island. If you go from north to the south, it gets more and more conservative. And I am not exactly sure how those folks feel about drag, probably negatively because they are being spoon-fed the conservative propaganda from Fox News, which they consume way too much. And that's, I think, why, for me, it's very important that Rusa has these events that highlight drag, because it's very important to have drag visible and present and represented right now to counter the negative imagery and negative portrait that the conservatives are trying to paint of drag, which I hope we get to talk about why they're doing that. And also, we try to book and spotlight and highlight drag performers who come from Russian-speaking countries. I have a drag child, as I say, who performs with us. We're still figuring out their name. At the moment is Mr. Drama Dolmar, and they've done drag back home in their city in Russia, and they came here and they wanted to do it, and we're trying to spotlight them because I think the strength comes in numbers, and if we have more drag performers that come from conservative places, that kind of becomes a very powerful manifestation of what we're fighting and what's possible.
Let me ask you about this because you did mention people coming from Russia to the States. And I think there's a whole host of questions I've got in there, as it relates to like acclimating or assimilating into,
Yes.
United States culture, which is just very different from Russian culture. And that's before you even throw in the added layer of, queerness, the difference between, what it means to be queer in Russia and what it means to be queer in the United States. Could you help me understand for like queer folks in Russia that then moved to the United States, what is particularly jarring or different for them in their experience with family, but also their experience with the queer community and with friends?
That's a very good question. I mean, it's curious for me because Russian culture is very queer. If you look at it, we have some of the most famous Russian cultural exports. From Tchaikovsky to Rudolf Nureyev to Tattoo to Verka Serduchka, who is Tattoo exactly.
Yeah,
See,
yeah,
like
yeah.
you're probably laughing because it's like a wow, what a throwback. But if you look at it from a historic point of view, it was like late 90s, early 2000s, and having two lesbians who were both fake, and one of them ended up trying to run for state government on a very homophobic platform. But that kind of visible queerness and open lesbianism and same-sex attraction that was in early 2000s. Tattoo was the most popular band, and it was also crossed over into the United States. And that just really signified that there was a queer renaissance at that time in Russia of a lot of these artists and performers. And Russian culture is inherently queer because there's a lot of very creative, artistic outlets through it. And that's always been, the space where queer people dominate. But, going back to your question, how do folks who come from Russia see queer culture here? In Russia, it's always been taboo. It's always been kind of kept under, or it's always been very coded. There has been drag in very famous movies, think Tootsie, but Russian films. And a lot of Russian performers do highly elaborate, I would say, drag costumes. They might not be in like full contoured, highlighted face, but it's very out there. But it's always coded in a way that it's always performance. It's not queerness. And for folks who come from Russia here, especially, folks who are coming from Russia now, as opposed to, 15 years ago before the passage of the gay propaganda laws, they come here and they see, I can tell you specifically about the pride parades. I was lucky to lead the Brighton Beach Pride Parade this year, but also we walked in the NYC Pride March, the biggest one in the world. And we had our own column, and I can tell you that we had around 300 people. Don't tell the NYC Pride folks because we were only supposed to have 75, but who's counting? And we had 300 people, and I would say 90% of those 300 were people who came to the country less than a year ago. So brand new immigrants. This is their first Pride. And the feeling that I've been hearing from them, because overwhelming sensation is safety. The fact that they can proudly walk with rainbow flags, holding hands with a bunch of people like them down, one of the most famous avenues in the world with millions of spectators, corporations behind it, music, TV, and then they can just walk free without the police attacking them, without being hurled on, without being, thrown things at. The police aspect is something that I've been hearing a lot is that for people, and I know that queer community in the United States and police have a very tense its own history. Obviously, Stonewall was a rebellion against the police. But now, for those Russian folks who come from a police state, which Russia is, that is enforcing systemic homophobia, for folks like that to see police, being at Pride, walking in Pride, having a police car with rainbows on it is just such a dissonant but euphoric feeling that gives them a sense of safety that they've never experienced before.
So you mentioned the gay propaganda laws in Russia. So the first iteration, I think, was that around 2013?
Yes.
And then they were just recently updated. I want to say that queer rights in Russia haven't always been as bad as the situation is now. You correct me if I'm wrong, but I do feel like the past 10 years, maybe 15, have been particularly bad. Putin has taken a really hard line, and as a result, the government has taken a really hard line. And I guess I've got a couple of questions for you. One is, I'm wondering if you have any insight as to what you think is actually happening here, because I'm not entirely sold on the fact that the initial thrust from Putin was pure gay animus as much as it was him trying to find an avenue to shore up support.
Mm-hmm.
My other question then is, so what is life like for queer people in Russia right now, today?
You might have to ask me a second question again, because there are two very big questions.
Sure.
A little history of that gay propaganda law, or just Russia in the last 20 years. So when Soviet Union collapsed and Georgia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan all became their own countries, one of the first laws that Russia repealed was basically the law that banned homosexuality and would send queer people to concentration camps. That was a law in Soviet Union, which a lot of people somehow are not aware. A lot of communists people who identify as communists here in the United States like to overlook that fact. But that was a law. You couldn't be queer in Soviet Union. That was a crime. And then that's what was one of the first laws they repealed when Russia collapsed. The Soviet Union collapsed and Russia became capitalist democratic system. And then we saw that sparked, as I mentioned earlier, like a queer renaissance. I've heard from folks who are, I guess, now in their 40s, who remember the late 90s and 2000s, saying that the best parties were always in the queer clubs, gay clubs. There was an incredible amount of freedom that was in the air, and queerness and embrace of queerness was one of the, I don't want to say symptoms, but I guess the way that this freedom was felt among young people. As I mentioned, and there was tattoo, and we had famous drag artists, and there was a sense, and there was some conversation happening about queerness, but most of what the country was doing was slowly becoming okay with the idea of queerness, specifically homosexuality. Transgender rights are a bit different, and I'm gonna get to it in a second to answer how things are now. And then once Putin came to power back in 2012, because we had a different president between 2008 and 2012. We had Dmitry Medvedev, who was, appointed by Putin, and Putin was still prime minister and calling all the shots. But Medvedev was kind of liberal. Now he is a Fox Newsy kind of mouthpiece who just says the most ridiculous stuff.
He's gone off the deep end. Yeah.
He jumped into the Mariana Trench hard.
Yeah.
But he used to be relatively liberal, and I remember when he was president, there was more of a sense of good Western influences. That was also back when the economy was much better. $1 was 30 rubles as opposed to 75 that it is now. So it was just a sense of freedom and Westernization. And then when Putin came to power, it became very clear that things are about to shift dramatically. And that was visible to me during his inauguration, when there was no people in the inauguration and there was massive protests, and the protests were partially, suppressed. I've seen people beaten in these protests. I've seen people arrested. And that was one of the heavy decisions that made me leave Russia. And that's when 2010 was when they passed the anti-pedophilia law. Hardcore, but kind of the same thing that we're seeing now here and happening in the United States. Kind of the same logic of, we're protecting the children, so we're coming for the pedophiles. However, as with most religions, organized religions, there's a lot of pedophiles in the church, and the law wasn't targeting them. The law was very explicitly targeting queer people, especially homosexual men. for the pedophilia. And that was kind of the first seeds planted in people's mind and in legislation. So that was the first law that was passed. And then in around 2013, we saw this gay propaganda law coming from St. Petersburg, which is kind of ironic because St. Petersburg is a major cultural liberal center. I would say more cultural and much more liberal than even Moscow, which is ironically where Putin is from St. Petersburg. And there was this local politician, Vitaly Milonov, who is this hardcore anti-LGBTQ religious conservative who, if you look at him, he has a glory hole face. Like when you look at him, that's clearly a queen. That's clearly a closeted queen. But he introduced this law in St. Petersburg. He used that law, Milonov, to kind of get national clout as this voice against LGBTQ, and then he was elected to the federal government, and then that law became a federal law. So it started as a state law and became a federal law once those politicians came to the federal government, the state government. You can think about what will happen if Ron DeSantis becomes president, kind of that thing. And then they passed the gay propaganda law. It was very explicitly vague, so that anything could be considered gay propaganda law. So what that law did was eradicate any mention of queerness on TV, because that is public to the kids. So basically, if a kid sees any conversation about that could be exposed to it, it becomes a problem. Queer clubs continue to exist, drag continued to exist, but it had to go into more of a hiding. That was kind of how things were for 8-9 years. And obviously the screws were being tightened here and there. But once the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022, I remember at the very beginning, before the war even started, there was a lot of conversation about whether the war is going to happen or not. And there was a lot of articles in the media about how there is a kill list of queer activists that Putin has in case he invades and overtakes Ukraine. There was a lot of conversation about that, and that is because queer people in Russia are some of the most vocal critics of the government. So to silence queer people is to silence a big chunk of the opposition. Once the war started, they pretty fast passed the law banning homosexual propaganda to all people. So it went from minors to adults. And they passed a couple of other laws, and they've actually enforced. They started to just be more proactive and aggressive in cutting out and going after queer people. And then obviously this year, I think after seeing and being inspired by the legislation in the United States, they came for trans folks. And I got to tell you, trans people have had recognition and rights to exist as a trans person, almost going back to Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Transition was something that was kind of, it was a process that was happening. It wasn't too politicized. Trans people were able to change their gender mark. They were able to have access to medication until basically this year when they started. In Russia, they started coming after trans people kind of with the same surgical precision and intensity that the way that the Nazis under Hitler came for the very first institute that studied trans people and was performing gender assignment care. So I think we as Rusa see a lot of these queer folks coming from Russia. We've seen a major influx of queer couples, even with kids leaving. And I think we're expecting now the same wave for trans folks. Why did Putin do it? I don't think Putin hates queer people. I think maybe self-hate. There's rumors that Putin himself is queer, and not just, somebody on the internet as a joke came up with rumors, but pretty credible allegations from somebody who knows Putin going back and who has written his books and kind of, filled the gaps, as always does. Some of the most vocally homophobic people are closeted queer people. Some, not all. But I think that Putin saw that queer people is still something that is so new and foreign to most of Russian people's mentalities, especially the people who've lived under Soviet Union for so many years, where it was ingrained in their minds that this is bad. So he saw that queer people, it basically scapegoated. Because if you go to Russia, even 10 years ago, if you go to big cities, yes, it looks pretty, but the systems were collapsing. The medical system was collapsing. The education system was collapsing. The roads, the electricity, just the all the good infrastructure that was left from Soviet Union was not maintained and honestly heavily neglected because of corruption. But Putin was never interested in bettering the lives of his people or making Russia this powerful nation by building up its own society. So Putin kind of saw that this is kind of the same thing that a lot of dictators do. They choose a small dictators and fascists. They choose a small minority that most people would not relate to because they don't know somebody who's queer, or they don't know somebody that's trans, or they don't know that, or they actually do know those people, but they don't know that they are because they're not out. So he was able to shift the perspective so that instead of complaining about how bad the government is, Putin took Russian people's homophobia to distract them from his own inability to govern. In Russia, they say gay Europa, like gay Europe, basically in a way to vilify the West, to kind of diminish any progressive or technological or quality of life developments that you will find in Europe, or United States, or Canada, or Mexico, or the Western world that you won't find in Russia. But then would you want to go to Europe, but they would call it gay Europa because they have gay people? You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's this kind of like, you don't want higher quality of life because they have gay people who will come for your children. And that's kind of the political manipulation that Putin is doing. And I think he has his own feelings about queer people. But I gotta tell you, as somebody who grew up in Moscow and knows people in the queer scene, in Moscow, if you're queer and you want to have a good life, you either go to show business or you go to politics. A lot of our politicians are queer. Our current Speaker of the Duma, which is Russian, one of the Russian chambers of parliament, is queer and is gay, and he lives with another famous actor in Russia. One of our previous speakers, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, who is one of Russia's most notorious politicians. He's like the Russian Trump who always said the most outrageous things. He was gay, and he was once almost outed by Alla Pugacheva on national TV during the debates. Alla Pugacheva is Russia's prima donna of pop music. She called him out on stage in front of everybody during the debates in 2012 for the presidential election, saying that he likes to go to the sauna with young boys. To understand Russia's treatment of queer people, you have to also understand the system that was created for queer people in Russia to sell themselves out and throw other queer people under the bus for their own protection and betterment.
As you're talking, I think there are some parallels, and you've talked a little bit about this, to what's happening in the United States. And it's really difficult to draw like a causal line, because I think that at periods of time, it might look like the United States is mimicking what's happening in places like Russia as it relates to anti-LGBT laws. In other ways, Putin might be taking lessons from what's happening in the States. I'm thinking of DeSantis's Florida.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really hard to distinguish, which came first, the chicken or the egg. But I do think there are parallels here. And I'm really struck by you saying that the infrastructure and civil society were degrading in Russia long before it was obvious, because I've been saying, or these are conversations I've been having lately about the United States, that there's a lot of stuff that we're seeing, like chaff that's thrown in the sky that, we look at and we say like, oh, this is terrible, what's happening in Florida or in Texas or in Tennessee, or what's happening to our democracy or the rise of the far right, et cetera. But if you really dig into like civil society in the United States, people aren't getting their mail on time anymore, and people can't get through to Social Security. There's a whole host of these types of things that seem to be just degrading. But that all being said, I do think to some degree, Russia is more cohesive on the national level with their anti-LGBTQ legislation than so far we are in the United States. And we've also seen in both countries, but we can point to a very horrific attack in Chechnya against an activist recently. And there's well-documented cases of, regular vicious attacks on queer people in Russia, as there are accounts of that happening in the States as well. But I wonder your thoughts here. As you look at what's happening in the States, and we are starting to, or at least the Republican Party is starting to coalesce around this same sentiment that we're seeing in Russia, if you have any concerns that we might see significant spikes in not just the protest, but violence against queer people.
You're not going easy on me here, Sean.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Great question. Here's what I'll say. Thank God you're calling it consistent on a national level in the homophobia in Russia. It's because Putin is, the Tsar, the party, the policy dictators for the entire country. There is no deviations from, there are a little bit deviations from the general policy, whether, some places like Chechnya are just probably one of the most dangerous places for queer people. It's not just violence. They straight up murder them. They murder queer people. They find them in other cities and sometimes in other countries, bring them back to Chechnya and murder them. But Chechnya is a very complicated, very, very complicated conversation. But I think that, from a point of view of civil society in the United States, thank God we have two-party system. Even though two-party system is not as good as multi-party system, but then again, we always know that to any action, there is going to be a reaction. The Republicans are going to stand up to what the Democrats are doing and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
I see a lot of similarities between what's happening in Russia and what's happening here in the respect of conservative politicians who are really bad at their jobs and enacting policy that benefits their communities. And instead of fixing the important stuff that would better the lives of their communities, they choose to attack queer people for the same scapegoating purposes.
Mm-hmm.
Why is Texas passing the most amount of anti-trans legislation when they have problems with their grid and people are dying in summer because it's too hot and they're dying in winter because it's too cold?
Mm-hmm.
And, Texas has one of the highest childbirth mortalities in the world. And instead of taking that legislative time to pass infrastructure bill that would rebuild their grid or pass some kind of a healthcare bill that would make sure that every hospital has an OBGYN so we prevent women from dying in childbirth, not even going to go into the whole anti-abortion sentiment. But they're taking the legislative time, they're taking taxpayers' money, which is, I am furious about. We as taxpayers are paying these people to go to state legislatures to enact bills, and they're taking our money to waste time passing bills that are not benefiting anybody. It's just bad policy and it's bad politics. So I am being a little bit optimistic because I'm a registered Democrat. I'm not entirely happy with the Democratic Party, but at least the Democratic Party is very quickly realizing that good policy is good politics. And I'm very grateful that the Democrats, with partnership of, 10 Republicans, 10, 11 Republicans who voted for protection of marriage equality as much as they could to do it on a federal level with the law that they passed earlier. Of course, if somebody like DeSantis gets to the White House and Republicans take control of both House and Senate, it's going to be absolutely terrible for queer people, even in Democratic states, because, the federal government can override and pass some federal laws. And then it can bring us to a brink of civil war. If, for example, DeSantis becomes president and they would pass a federal law banning gender affirming care for adults. What if New York passes a law that says, no, we're actually going to continue providing, gender affirming care for adults and minors? And then what if DeSantis sends federal troops to the state because New York is not enforcing federal laws? These are just the hypothetical scenarios I'm thinking about, because this is, as you mentioned, the Republican Party is now coalescing around this, which is kind of mind-boggling to me, the fact that the Republican Party was always proudly more anti-Russia than Democrats. And they, makes me think of folks like John McCain, who was always a hawk on Russia, or Mitt Romney, who we owe an apology to Mitt Romney. When Mitt Romney said in 2012 and then Russia is the biggest geopolitical adversary of the United States, and Obama and the whole world laughed at him, he ended up being correct. And Obama was wrong on most of the foreign policy, from Iran to Libya to Syria to Crimea. So it's a new wave of the Republican Party. It's the populists. And I am very disheartened to see that a lot of these Republicans, who would otherwise be called themselves moderates, are falling behind Trump and the Freedom Caucus and embracing just the most cruel policies that are not even in line with their small government, pro-family, pro-life approach. They're embracing ideologies of government overreach. They're embracing ideologies of violence and lawlessness, overthrowing the government, letting folks who were at January 6th to let them serve in the police. That does make me scared. But I also look at political trends, and, the 2022 midterms gave me a lot of hope, when we all were expecting it to be a red tsunami, and a lot of Democrats held strong. And we even added a seat in the Senate. Mm-hmm. From a historical point of view, the president's party never does well in the midterms, and then Republicans didn't do as well because I think Americans are rejecting the notions of ruling on hate, ruling on anti-abortion, ruling on being anti-LGBTQ, ruling on not supporting Ukraine, ruling on not being pro-gun control. So just the trends and the different and are giving me hope. And also the big difference, I would say, between Russia and United States is that in Russia, nobody fought. Mm. Nobody fought these anti-LGBTQ laws. The LGBTQ agencies and organizations did, but they were never as united or as big or as powerful in Russia. So, if in 2014 we had the entire show business and a lot of politicians coalesce together and be like, no, we don't support these laws, maybe something would have changed, but that's just not the system that Putin has set up. Very smartly, he has made sure that every channel of mass media communication and swaying, the show business, the news channels, the internet were spewing his messages. Here in the United States, we have people fighting. We have ACLU filing court cases in all different states, and we're seeing that a lot of the courts are reversing these anti-drag laws or anti-trans laws. We have people here who are fighting, and I am just hoping that people look at the historical examples of Hitler, but also at Russia, and realize that what's at stake, and we have to fight harder.
So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of hard not to.
Yes.
There's a huge Russian diaspora across the globe, and that's being exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, right? As yes. Russians are also fleeing their home country because of the war. To my mind, it seems like Russians are in an awkward spot just by virtue of being Russian right now in the world. Mm-hmm. I, as a queer person, often feel like if I'm in a place that has no queer people, I have to carry the weight of the queer community. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure Russian folks are in the same position, having to answer questions that, they don't have answers for and don't necessarily agree with. But I think there's an added challenge for queer Russian folks. In many ways, they're victims of, these anti-LGBTQ laws that we've talked about already in Russia. Then when they leave Russia, they're also, at least now, viewed skeptically in many parts of the world, primarily because of the war. And I guess I'm wondering if you're seeing any type of backlash, or of the folks that that have left, queer Russian folks, how are they navigating this?
It's another very complicated thing. Most of last year, a lot of my personal advocacy and activism work was focused on Ukraine, and specifically painting Ukraine as a fighter for LGBTQ rights, as a fighter for democracy. Obviously, the situation in Ukraine is still a lot of work has to be done for them to be the queer fire bearer, the torch bearer that we would want them to be. But I think the war is shifting a lot of people's in Ukraine and Ukrainians' perspective on queer rights, just because they see homophobia as an atavism of, Russian colonialism, but also because a lot of queer people in Ukraine are fighting on the front line. So my prediction is that once the war is won, the government will reward those queer people by giving them some kind of same-sex union or even marriage equality, the way that has been passed in one of the Baltic countries very recently. In terms of Russians who are escaping Russia because of the war in Ukraine, I know a lot of people, especially queer people, who have left Russia right at the beginning of the war. They were like, you know what, we're packing our bags and going. We, cannot continue to live in a country that is perpetuating genocide against Ukrainians. B, we don't feel safe ourselves because the writing is on the wall that once they occupy Ukraine, they're going to go even more Nazi within their own country. because Putin's a big dream is to bring back Soviet Union, not just territorially, but ideologically and socially. I've seen a lot of backlash to Russians last year and even this year because to some Ukrainians, every Russian is an enemy. I was in a similar predicament last year when I had to work harder as a Russian person to showcase my allyship. And eventually, Ukrainians saw that I am supporting them and they embraced me. And we did a lot of some really incredible awareness work. But last year, I had this thought a lot. I was like, is this what it felt like to be an anti Hitler German in 1939? You know, how did those people feel who were vehemently against Hitler policies, but couldn't do anything about it? My family, my mom, my grandma, my everybody in my family has always been anti-Putin and very pro-Ukraine right now. My mom and my sister are currently in Russia, so they have to be very careful about how they talk about this. I've seen a lot of skepticism last year. It's getting better this year towards help of Russian queer people, but I think that in United States particularly, because there has already been this ingrained anti-Russia sentiment. I've been asked ever since I moved to the United States in 2012 that, oh, Russia is so bad for gay people, which I've always like, this is not a conversation I want to be having. This is a Wendy's, ma'am. But now I understand that because there has been that social infrastructure of labeling Russia as not safe space for queer people, Americans have a lot more acceptance and empathy for Russian queer people and the work that Rusa is doing, which has been very handy when we have to advocate on behalf of Russian asylum seekers and refugees. A lot of people are like, you know what, we know what's happening in Russia. I think it's very important for people to understand that Ukrainians and queer Russians are suffering from the same system of fascism. We can draw a direct line between Putin's invasion of Ukraine and Putin's homophobic laws. It's the same system of suppression of anybody who's different, who does not want to confine to that Russian identity that Putin is shaping. There is still some tension between Ukrainians and Russians even now. There's been famously Masha Gessen, who is arguably the most famous Russian non-binary person in the world, a writer for The New Yorker, a pioneer who's been very outspoken against Putin and pro-queer, even back when they used to live in Russia. They were recently kicked off of a panel, I think, for New York Times or somewhere else, because the Ukrainians have complained that we don't want to be performing alongside Russians, even though that Russian is pro-Ukraine. I'm not going to put blame on Ukrainians. I understand that their country is being bombed by Russia, so they have every right to feel how they feel. But it's also not really fair to those Russians who've been anti-war, anti-Putin, pro-Ukraine, pro-freedom consistently to be getting the brunt. But I guess that's if we're talking about cultural responsibilities, I guess we all have to take a bit of that. I can tell you that in Europe, the situation is not as good as in the United States. In Europe, there is a very strong anti-Russian sentiment. There's this organization called LGBT World Beside, and they are a Russian-speaking organization for queer people in Amsterdam. They're actually led by a Chechen man. His name is Harlem. Hey, Harlem, if you're listening to this, he doesn't speak English, though, so probably not. And I've talked to him that there is now that the Dutch parliament has just changed the laws for how Russian people can apply for asylum and come, and they basically can't. So Russian queer people have a very hard time getting to Europe because the anti-Russian sentiment is stronger than a lot of these countries' sympathy for queer people within Russia, which I personally find incredibly hypocritical, but also lazy. You just don't seem to bother about actually helping people. I just also think it's very dumb. Why would you not let young, healthy, creative, queer people, doesn't matter from where they're from, who want to escape their country and come to yours? They can help grow your economy. They can bring their talent. They can bring their innovative, every country should want young, creative people to come to them. That is such a resource. So Europe is not there because Europe is having a lot of their own issues. I can also tell you personally My family has experienced a lot of anti-Russian nationalism in Austria, where my mom's dad has been living for the past 40 years. My mom's father passed away a couple of months ago. And my mom, being in Russia, had to go to Austrian embassy in Moscow and beg them to give her a visa to go see her dad and sell the apartment. They gave her a visa for 3 weeks. Have you ever heard of anybody giving anybody a visa for? Imagine your parent passed away and the government is only giving you 3 weeks visas to take care of that. That's just inhumane.
Mhm.
But that's something that, we've been experiencing. We've been seeing, I've been personally seeing, these are personal anecdotes of my family and my work that I can tell you. So I'm very grateful that the United States is a bit better in terms of accepting queer Russian folks, but also we have a pretty big diaspora around the world of Russian people. I was talking to a journalist this week who's writing a story on this, and he told me that Russians are currently the third largest block of immigrants coming to the United States. It's not even Ukrainians, because a lot of Ukrainians came last year. This year, it's Russians. It's an actual thing that requires more context, requires more empathy. And I think it's incredibly important to see these people as refugees, as asylum seekers who are escaping violence for being queer, for experiencing violence for being queer in Russia, who are trying to find peace and safety and respect and acceptance here in the United States, but also in other countries around the world.
So how can perhaps people listening, support Rusa's work?
People can donate to us. We are a nonprofit who runs on donations, on grants, and that money goes to us providing individual help to folks. We give out money for people so they can take a train ride or get food. We buy notebooks we can provide folks with notebooks so they can work. We connect them with lawyers. We connect them with housing. Just some of the stories that we hear from people is just, oh my God, I'm getting emotional. It's just the amount of trauma and journey that these people have to go through. Some people have to go through 12 countries just to get to the United States. Support our work, follow us on Instagram, spotlight us, tell your friends about us, because Russia is an incredibly dangerous place for queer people. And if we don't support the work that highlights that and supports those queer people coming here, this might very well happen in the United States. If you want to fight fascism, you have to support and help people who are running away from fascism and, systemic homophobia in different countries.
Okay, final question. Are you ready for it?
I don't know if I'm ready, but
we'll find out.
Yeah, we'll find out.
What's something interesting you've been reading, watching, listening to, or doing lately?
Oh, I started watching The Idol with Weekend and Lily Rose Depp. I know, controversial.
Oh, yeah. With The Weeknd, yeah.
With The Weeknd, I only watched one episode. I like it. I think I'm going to binge watch it. Something that I've been listening to a lot lately and something that's been giving me a lot of motivation and hope. I love listening to Ukrainian music. They have an incredible amount of amazing performers like Kaska and Alyosha and a lot of other performers who are just so incredible at taking Ukrainian folk music, which is such a symbol of national pride and resistance, and they add a modern twist to it. Like, Stefania, which won Eurovision last year.
Yeah.
The Kalush Orchestra, they make incredible music. So I like to listen to that music just because it's fun, it's beautiful, but it also gives me a feeling of spirit and motivation that is very much appreciated and needed lately and always.
I'm glad you mentioned Eurovision. This was the first year I ever watched it. I happened to be in UK this year.
Oh, wow.
And, it's not a big deal in the States. So I just wasn't it's not part of my culture. But so I watched it. Did you mention Dvorchi from Ukraine this year?
Yes, Dvorchi, they were incredible.
Yeah, it's a fun thing. I don't quite get it because it only, it's like semifinals and then the final. I don't get it.
Yes.
But I couldn't stop watching. It was very cool.
Yeah, it's American Idol, but if every contestant was, from a different country representing their entire nation. I can tell you that I've done some work with Eurovision. I've hosted Eurovision viewing parties last year and this year.
Mhm.
in New York. I can tell you that Eurovision is becoming more of a thing in among Americans, especially queer people, because it's just such a queer event. You know,
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
so many out queer people. It's very camp, a lot of pop music and just really cool stuff, and an air of acceptance and love. And I can tell you, last year there was only five Eurovision viewing parties happening in New York. This year there was 17.
Oh, wow.
So it's definitely a growing culture. As Eurovision is expanding, they have Australia now
Yeah, yeah.
participating. So it's becoming a global phenomenon.
It's fun for sure.
Yeah,
Maxim Eye-BAD-off, thanks for taking the time to chat with me today. I'd love to have you back sometime.
I would absolutely love to be back. And thank you for giving us the platform. And please support Rusa's work at rusalgbtq.org and on our Instagram, rusalgbtq.
My conversation with Maxim reminded me of two documentaries that I've seen recently that really tap into some of the themes we discussed. Things like war, anti-LGBT oppression and violence, leaving your home, being stateless, and loss. One of these is Welcome to Chechnya, a film by David France that documents the state of queer life in Chechnya by exposing state-sanctioned violence against the LGBT community and highlighting the high-stakes work of LGBT activists in the region. The other is a short documentary by the New York Times about Ukrainian children who have lost a parent in the war. It's called What is War to a Grieving Child? Full disclosure, both of these films are hard to watch. They're gut-wrenching and heart-rending. And honestly, for their rawness, I almost didn't get through them. But I'm wondering if the complacency and dismissiveness, sometimes belligerently so, of our contemporary Western lives is fueled by the fact that we've crafted an isolated world that precludes us from seeing and experiencing some of the existing horrors of the world. In the United States and Europe, we are generations into peace. Most of us are thankfully devoid of family members and friends that have directly experienced violent oppression or war. Our lives have not been touched by these things. And so we are emotionally removed from the devastation and the horror that these things that still exist in many places in the world are inflicting on innocent people. And not only do we no longer have any direct and personal relationship with tragedy, we can also tune it out, change the channel when it happens. And we do. We float through life crafting a world in which there is no horror, there is no suffering. And in that world, why would we ever go out of our way to help? The same week that the Titan submersible imploded off the eastern coast of the United States in late June, killing 5, a boat carrying about 750 Pakistani, Syrian, Egyptian, and Palestinian refugees and migrants, including children and infants, sunk off the coast of Greece while authorities watched, did not intervene from a near distance. Of those 750, only about 100 people were rescued alive. This story failed to capture our attention in any meaningful way. This is a perfect, tragic example of our ability to close our eyes to horror. And I wonder if this is part of the reason that we're experiencing such a quick rise of the far right around the globe, because we've lost the critical ability to empathize. The violent rhetoric and oppressive policies of these extremists just doesn't register, because we, 1, have no direct experience with the consequences, and 2, feel like we can just look away. Without these two components, we have no North Star anymore. I don't know what the answer is, but I think we need to be willing to be uncomfortable, to, at minimum, be willing to bear witness to some of these awful things happening to people around us. We need to rebuild that muscle of empathy and community responsibility. This is why I watched the documentaries, not because I'm into trauma porn, but because I need to be reminded that as comfortable as my life is, it's a nightmare for other people. And I can help in some way. Imagine if we all did, if we were all willing to bear witness. It might make a bigger difference than you think. Links to the documentaries I mentioned are in the show notes. All right, check back soon for another episode of Deep Dive. Chat soon, folks.